Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this meeting on climate change and flooding. Um, we've got some great speakers lined up for you this morning, followed by a panel discussion. And you are free to ask questions along the way or during that session at the end. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for the day, which is Michelle McIlvin, who's the chair of the Committee for Infrastructure in Northern Ireland. So Michelle, if I can hand over to you, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Graham. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for attending this morning's conference, Climate Change and Flooding, Building Resilient Homes and Communities. As Graham has said, my name is Michelle McIlveen and I'm the MLA for the Strangford constituency and also chair of the Committee for Infrastructure at the Northern Ireland Assembly. And I'm delighted to have been asked to open your conference today. And I'd like to thank the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management, Flood Re and Watertight International for sponsoring today's event. Flooding is a major issue, not just in Northern Ireland, but globally, with governments taking steps to mitigate against the worst effects of flooding through the building of community defence barriers and the provision of property flood resilience defences. In recent years, flooding to homes and businesses in Northern Ireland has presented considerable challenges to both people and communities directly affected and those providing emergency responses to it. Flooding can have potentially devastating impacts on human life and health, damage to property, pollution to rivers and the sea, and severe impacts on economic activity, infrastructure and the environment. According to the Association of British Insurers, the average cost to householders affected by a flood is £32,000, and people and businesses may face months out of their properties whilst repairs are made to the damages caused as a result of flooding. Flooding is also becoming much more frequent, and climate projections indicate changing rainfall patterns, rising sea levels, and more extreme weather conditions, and that will increase in the currents in the future. In Northern Ireland, it's estimated that 1 in 33 properties are currently at risk from flooding from rivers or the sea. This includes 36,000 properties at risk of flooding from reservoirs and 24,500 at risk from surface water. Over a 40-year period, the chances of an individual witnessing a 100-year period flood is at 33%, or 1 in 3, while the chances of an individual witnessing a 10-year flood is 99%, or almost certain. This worryingly shows how incidents of a catastrophic flood event are becoming a much more regular occurrence. The Committee for Infrastructure recently received a departmental briefing on reservoirs in anticipation of the transfer of functions. This provided an update on the department's plans to ensure this risk of flooding is minimised, and there will no doubt be more detail and opportunities to participate in a consultation process in the coming months in relation to that specifically. The department is also undertaking a consultation exercise on the Northern Ireland Flood Risk Management Plan 21-27, and I would encourage everyone with an interest to respond to this important consultation. This plan will set the course of direction for how the department plans to manage the flood risk in Northern Ireland and the steps which will be needed to be taken to ensure properties are protected. It's important for you to respond to this consultation. In fact, it's important for you to respond to many of the consultations that do come out of the department, as there is a need for the department to get this plan in particular right. I'm confident that flooding will be an issue for the committee, and we certainly will be returning to it before the end of the current mandate. Returning to today's event, we have an excellent lineup of speakers. We'll hear from Angela Terry on climate change and the risk of flooding as we try to meet the twin challenges of flood and climate change. Mary Dono will discuss putting people at the heart of climate resilience, and this will look at the impact of flooding on people and communities with some lessons learned and plans. Dermot Keogh will update on Flood Re's perspective on planning for the future. Ross Jones from DEFRA and Vicky McCausland from the Environment Agency will discuss proposals and strategies to encourage greater uptake of property flood resilience to limit the damage and disruption flooding can cause. The final speaker of the day will be Alistair Chisholm from the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management on raising the bar on skills and standards, the industry code of practice, and what this means for Northern Ireland practitioners, industry and policymakers. And we'll then finish up with a discussion with each of the speakers before passing over to Graham to close out today's proceedings. So once again, thank you very much for attending, and what I'm sure will be an interesting and very worthwhile event, with the opportunity for us to learn more about how we can tackle flooding and provide greater support to communities and householders who are impacted by it. So I hope that you enjoy your morning, and thank you very much for allowing me to participate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you for running through the order. Next up then, as just discussed, we've got Angela Terry, who will be talking about climate change specifically. It specialises in that area. So Angela, please, can I hand over to you?
Yes, thank you, Graham, and thank you, Michelle. So I'm Angela Terry. I established One Home, which is to provide the public with practical solutions to climate change. Climate change is an issue that is not going to go away. It is increasing every day, the problems that come with climate change. And it is something that people are not yet used to having to think about themselves in their daily lives. So we see hurricanes, we see things on telly, and our human nature is to try and go, oh, those poor people, but it's not me, it doesn't affect me. And so we need to have a cultural shift, which basically says climate change is impacting us all already. And the more we talk about it and the more we're aware of it, the more motivated people will be to act on climate change. So what I'll be doing today is just giving a quick run through of the science around climate change to explain why flooding is increasing and what we can do to stop climate change, and then talk a bit more about the different types of flooding and the reasons behind them. But I wanted to start by saying my first ever holiday with my boyfriend, who is now my husband, was around the coast of Northern Ireland, obviously, to the Giant Causeway and other places. So I appreciate completely what a beautiful and precious place it is. And probably the other thing to say, given yesterday's and today's news, is that climate change has nothing to do with borders, politics, religion, race. It is down to physics, and basically the more carbon pollution we put into the atmosphere, the hotter the world becomes. With global warming, the more we heat the atmosphere and our oceans, the more extreme weather events happen, basically. So we have a twin track approach. We basically have to stop the pollution, which primarily comes from fossil fuels, burning fossil fuels, and then we also have to adapt to those extreme weather events, because they are not going away. In fact, they're only going to get worse. So this might sound like the messenger of doom, but we actually have quite a lot of solutions. And this is what today's seminar is all about, is about how we actually protect lives and livelihoods, that we increase our resilience, which basically means forewarned is forearmed. If we know what's coming down the line, we can prepare for it, we can adapt, and we can keep people safe and keep the things they love and protect our one home, basically. So that's what I'll be running through today. I've only got 15 minutes, so ask questions. I love questions because it helps me sort of understand what people are interested in as well. So please ask questions as I go along. And you can always contact me afterwards as well if you want to follow up on anything I say. So the long and the short of it is that we, on the Earth, where we live, the sun comes down, the sun's heat comes down to our planet and enters our atmosphere. And our atmosphere is mainly made up of nitrogen and oxygen. That's pretty much what our atmosphere is made up of. And a tiny bit of carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gases, which keep our planet nice and stable and warm so that we can survive and thrive. But what's happened is the balance has been completely disturbed the balance of nature, because we have been drilling out oil and gas and coal from under the ground. So fossil fuels that have been in the ground for millions of years when the dinosaurs were around, and we've been burning them. Now, that process, that industrial revolution, actually happened in the UK. So in terms of global historic carbon footprints, the UK is number 5 in the world for carbon pollution. So what we have in the UK, if we look at our UK emissions at the moment, they have actually come down nearly 50% since 1990 because of our amazing technology advances and our ability to innovate and create new green jobs, such as offshore wind farms and solar panels and energy efficiency. So simple things like the whole country switching from tungsten light bulbs to LEDs has allowed our demand on the grid to come down significantly. So what has to happen now, it's called the race to zero, is that we have legislated to be net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So there's some types of pollution we can't stop, such as burping from cattle and dairy cows, and natural rotting in ecosystems. So what net zero means is that we want to reduce pollution altogether. And what that really means is we need to stop burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. Now, we have the technology to do this. We will be doing this. It's just a case of how fast we go. So the slower we switch to clean energy, the more harm will be done, the more damage will be done, the more livelihoods will be upset. There was a report yesterday from the International Red Cross and Crescent that basically said already climate change is responsible for over 80% of environmental incidences which are causing mass migration around the world. So it has huge impacts both in our homes, our communities, and around the world in terms of destabilizing the world. And the army referred to it as a threat multiplier, basically. So where things were already tough, like water shortages and things, food shortages, climate change makes these things worse. So we know how to fix climate change. We just need to get on and do it. UK is hosting the climate conference this November in Glasgow. It's called the Conference of the Parties, COP26, because it's the 26th one. That is where every single country will be submitting their school report, basically, how they're going to tackle this problem. And there's top of the class people, and the UK is one of the top of the class at promising to act on this. And Joe Biden has obviously just brought America back into that process, and he's promised to halve emissions in the next decade and a half. So it's incredible what some people are pledging to do. But there are other countries, particularly countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia, Australia and Brazil, that are still very dependent on fossil fuels in their economy, who are the laggards, basically. So there's a lot of geopolitics going on in this as well. But what we know is that our economy in that period has flourished. And even today, there's a report out saying 33 million jobs could be created from the rush to wind and other renewable sources. So this whole idea of new industries and the opportunity it presents to save the planet is incredible. So that's kind of the good news. We know how to fix this problem. We have the technologies. They're often cheaper. So an all-electric car is already cheaper than a petrol or diesel car. Yet the fashion is, fueled by the car companies and the marketing agencies, is to buy great big heavy SUVs that do lots of polluting. So the human tendency to be swayed to do things that are sort of economically, financially, health and safety against our goodwill is still there, which is why the need to talk to people about climate change and what's at risk is so important, to encourage them to do things that will be in their long-term interest. But I can talk more about that campaign and what we've been doing at One Home, work with the media if people are interested later on. But let's get back to climate change and what's causing it, because I'm conscious I could talk forever about this subject. So the greenhouse gases, basically, the more we put into the atmosphere, the hotter the world gets. Now, this is crucially important for flooding for two reasons. Basically, the ocean is warmer. Now, when the ocean is warmer, it means the evaporation is happening faster. And it's also why those hurricanes are increasing in their strength and their size all around the world. Hurricanes, cyclones, typhoons, whatever you want to call them. Now, those superstorms then, because we're all interconnected, I go back to my point, we are all interconnected. There is only one planet. Those superstorms, then we are on the tail end. So our weather system, and we go back to the beginning, sorry, I should have a little globe here to do this, but the sun is strongest at the equator, and we have the poles, the Arctic at the north and the Antarctic at the bottom. They are the fridges of our planet. So the heat comes in at the equator level, and it rises and goes out to the polar regions. Now, what is happening is, firstly, the oceans are warming much faster than the atmosphere. So the atmosphere has warmed about 1 degree in general, but it's happening twice as fast at the polar regions. Now, that means the ice is melting and our weather systems are weakening because of that, because the difference between hot and cold is getting weaker, which is weakening the Gulf Stream. So most of our winds, most of our weather comes from the southwest and brings the rains with it, which is why Ireland, the southwest of England where I live, Scotland from the north, always gets much more rain than in the east of England. So that's how the rain evaporates, comes across in clouds, and then falls down through rain. And we're used to our seasons in the UK. We are a temperate climate and we have 4 seasons. What is happening now is that those seasons, we're seeing more and more extreme weather, and that extreme weather is lasting for longer. So we always used to say April showers. Well, April's due to be this year the driest April ever recorded. Our records, the amazing thing about the whole history of like the scientific royal societies that we have is that our records, our scientific records, are world beating. So they go back to 1850. So we have hundreds of years of data records for temperature and weather. So we know this is happening. We know it's man-made. So we are having, the last 10 years were the hottest on record. Last year was the hottest on record. We are just seeing an increase in rise in average temperatures. And the hotter it becomes, the atmosphere holds more water. You know, when you have a hot shower, the room is hot, and then when it hits the window, the cold, the condensation comes out. So basically, for every 1 degree hotter the atmosphere is, the atmosphere can hold 7% more water. So that is why we're having increasing extreme weather events and the flash floods that come with it. But the other issue is that if a weather system is over the land, it gets stuck, which is why we have these issues where people who have already flooded, the rain just keeps coming, basically. So the land is saturated, the farmland's saturated, the soil's saturated, and there's nowhere else for the water to go. And that's why we're having streets turn to streams and roads turn to rivers. And people just keep coming onto TV and going, this has never happened in our lifetime. This is the worst it's ever been. Now, the unfortunate issue is that this situation is only going to get worse. We know for a fact that we are currently on a projection to have 3 degrees of warming. So just to recap, we're only at 1 degree Celsius of warming at the moment. So unless we drastically cut all our greenhouse emissions immediately, which we're in no way going to do because everyone's still buying SUVs and burning gas and oil and everything, the atmosphere is going to keep getting hotter and flooding is going to keep increasing, basically. The other thing to mention is that the CO2 doesn't leave the atmosphere. The only way it can leave the atmosphere is by things like trees. So taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through growing trees. So basically, once that pollution's up there, it's going to stay there. And every time the sun comes out every day, the world gets hotter and hotter. So this is why we're ending up looking forward, horizon, preparing, planning, looking at which communities are at risk. It's really important to note that just because some houses haven't flooded yet, it does not mean they are safe. And that is a public perception issue that is very hard to imagine a future that's very different to what they recognize as their shared community history, basically. So that is the flooding episode. Then the other thing to mention is sea level rise and coastal erosion. basically, because the polar regions are warming twice as fast as everywhere else, there's lots of extra fresh water coming into the oceans, and the oceans are expanding due to thermal expansion. Now, sea level rise is accelerating. So basically, think of an ice drink on holiday. You know, when we used to go to foreign places in hot weather, the hotter it is, the quicker that ice will melt, basically. So we are having what we call a positive feedback loop, where basically the hotter it gets, the faster the ice is melting, the quicker sea levels are rising. Not only are sea level rising, but we have more extreme weather events, which means the waves are getting bigger and more frequent. So the coast is being battered more often and more extreme with rising sea levels. So it's destabilizing the cliffs. On top of that, then we have extreme weather, both the drought, which is cracking the soil through just the dryness, and also the extreme rainfalls. And that together is destabilizing what people have built their homes on. A lot of our infrastructure is around the coast. And so we have, and our reservoirs potentially as well are being weakened by these extreme weather events. So that is why we are seeing communities, especially coastal communities, and bearing in mind most towns and cities all around the world were located for their access to sea ships for transport and sanitation and water access. So we have a disproportionate impact of sea level rise to the public, to business, to our way of life, basically. So that is a very quick summary about flooding and climate change, and why we have to do everything in our power to stop pollution, but also we have to do everything in our power to make sure that our communities are aware of these changes, because basically once you leave school, your sort of official education stops. So how do we tell people about changes that are happening much faster than anyone ever imagined? And that's where this whole idea of, Michelle mentioned the consultation, it's so important that people are aware of the changes that will impact them and start to feel power, because to feel hopeless does nothing. Greta Thunberg always says the best way to feel hope is to start to take action. And it's in bringing everyone together to work together about how we can best solve this problem. We stop that feeling of despair, but we also get the most done. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Some very sobering thoughts there, and a good account of where we are with climate change, as always, which will set us up nicely for our next speakers. Just before we move on to our next speaker, I just wanted to mention that all of our speakers will be on a panel discussion at the end of these presentations. So if you've got any questions that you would like to pose for them during that panel discussion, please place them in the QA box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. So if you just hover at the bottom, the QA box should just pop up. And if you put them in there, I will do my best to go through as many of them as possible at the end. So once again, thank you, Angela. Our next speaker is Mary Donnoh. Mary is an avid campaigner for flood and PFR, has been doing it for a long, long time. And I've worked with Mary on many occasions, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy her next presentation very much, which is going to look at how you can adapt your properties to recover more quickly from flooding. So Mary, if I can hand over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Graham. And Angela, I just thought you set the scene brilliantly. You're amazing. I've got a bit of a lady crush on you now, just perfect. So if we could have the first slide, please. What I'm saying is literally following on from what Angela said. So this is the devastation that we face. I have to say that I've been flooded myself on many occasions. So this is the devastation that we face as flood victims, and this is the scenes that you see on television and cameras, and when the media come to visit. But the next slide, please, will show you the aftermath. My home is included in that, so I'm sort of happy to share with you the devastation that I went through. What people don't realise when the minister and media have gone, that most people are out of their home for about 9 months while it's repaired and reinstated and put back to normal. In the meantime, people are trying to live a normal everyday life, having lost their home, their sanctuary, everything they hold dear into a skip. Their memories are washed away. I lost my children's first handprints and their little playgroup pictures, everything that I couldn't replace with an insurance claim. So if you could go on to the next one, please. So what can be done at a property level to reduce the awful impact a flood can have? Next slide, please. One thing I'm absolutely passionate about is we've got to stop our over-reliance on the humble, inefficient and environmentally polluting sandbags. They don't work. They merely filter the water to enable people to have slightly cleaner water inside their homes. So let's move forward to using this next examples on the next slide. Property flood resilience. These barriers that are all fine examples of keeping the water out. I particularly like the one with the sandbags. You can see the sandbags failing, but the barrier is working, and actually outside the picture is a pair of red shoes, totally dry red shoes from the people that own that house. One thing that I'm very aware of is that we've seen due to climate change, we are seeing municipal defences overtopped, breached, compromised, and as Angela said, the earth is sodden. There's nowhere for the water to go but into our homes. Now, one thing I did at my home level, because I was flooded repeatedly due to a sewage problem, which has been rectified, is that I made my home 20 years ago flood recoverable. So when I was flooded again in 2007, instead of being displaced for 9 months, I was able to pump out, sanitize, mop, dehumidify, and we're back downstairs within a matter of just a few weeks. Such a powerful difference between 9 months and a few weeks. And since then, I have been working hard to find out what can be done at a property level to either try and keep it out, but we've got to be aware that those barriers may well overtop and they may well leak. So really my main focus has always been on recoverability, how we can recover from floods. So in the last few years, in partnership with the Environment Agency and Flood Re, I have been travelling around the country talking to real home owners and real businesses, not show homes, but real ones, to find out what they have done to make their homes recover more easily, and cataloguing what they've done. And then again, when many of the homes in this EMAG, which incidentally can be found on my Twitter handle @FloodMary, or my website, marydonno.co.uk. It's on the front page. It's got over 40 case studies, really powerful ones, and very positive case studies. So I revisited them all, and I'm going to give you just a brief overview of 3 of them. Now, this is one of my favourites. She was new in 2020. She lives in Cumbria, Karen and her family. And I'm not going to read out everything for you. You're perfectly capable of doing that. But what I liked best about Karen's story was her broad acceptance that due to the depth of water and her proximity to the river, that she would flood. She acknowledged that her upgraded barrier would give her longer to move her belongings. And with the help of community volunteers after Storm Desmond, they reviewed just what furniture they would keep downstairs, and also what type of furniture they'd use. So if you could see the next slide, please. You can see here that they've got solid wood furniture, which experience has shown me that solid wood recovers very easily from a flood, and solid wood doors, mahogany furniture, it can all be allowed to dry and to recover. So she had emptied her home and put everything up there. She also had help from community volunteers to help her move her stuff. They've got an excellent example in Cumbria where the volunteers knock doors of people that are at risk of flooding to help them move their furniture, especially helpful for the elderly and the vulnerable. If we could have the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, can we just go back again to Karen? She was flooded again. And I want to give you some stats here, really. After Storm Desmond in 2015, in Karen's home, she had 1.5 meters of water. After all the moves she'd taken, she only had 5 centimeters of water. Now, her resilience works in total cost £15,000, and her insurance claim for Storm Desmond, when she had 1.5 meters, was £48,000. So after the flood in Storm Ciara in 2020, as I've said, she only had the 5 centimeters. She was able to return home. Instead of being out of her home for 9 months, she returned home after 24 hours, and her insurance claim was absolutely nothing. So it was PFR doing its work, adaptation working at its best. And I think that story is incredibly powerful. Now, this one is Martin. And Martin lives right on the banks of the River Aire in Leeds. And as you can see, in 2015, he'd already taken moves to reduce the impact a flood could have, but his flood barriers sadly didn't work, and they were overtopped. So if you can see some of the things he's done, he increased the height of his flood barrier, and obviously the structural integrity of his home was checked first to make sure it could work, it could accommodate higher barriers. He installed self-closing air bricks, and he repointed his walls because floodwater will get its wicked way in anywhere. And he put in solid flooring, and also, if we can go on to another one, he's got sumps and pumps and membranes and backup batteries and plastic flooring. And the plastic flooring just looks like laminate flooring, so it's incredibly beautiful. One of the things people worry about when they make resilient adaptations is that their homes will look ugly. Well, Martin's home certainly doesn't look ugly at all. Because everything, can we go back to that? Because everything is discreet and looks normal. But the positive news here is that Martin had 3 weeks worth of flood warnings from the Environment Agency during 2020 storms. And because of his internal membranes and his pumps and the barriers, he didn't flood at all. And that is just amazing. And in fact, his wife joked when I went to visit her that they had more trouble from their incontinent cat than they did from the floodwater raging absolutely outside. So again, another powerful story of adaptation. Now, this one, I have done a special feature on Hebden Bridge, because poor Hebden Bridge suffered terribly from flooding, and they have been flooded so many times with so-called 1-in-100-year floods. And as you can see here, that the Element Jewellery, which is right in the centre of town, it's a double-fronted shop, and obviously it keeps the centre of town alive, it employs local people. But as you can see from that photograph, that the shops were shut for, she said, from her worst flood. And I'm just cataloguing her worst flood. I've been to Hebden on many occasions, and this 2015 was her worst flood. And she was shut for 111 days. So some of the measures she took was her walls were stripped back to stone and then sealed. And she had flood doors fitted and rain screen panels that could be wet. And her display panels, which we can see on the next slide, please, were made from powder coated acrylic steel. She'd got concrete floors, she'd got sofas that they could move, and they had a dedicated storage area, which was created, as you can see in the middle picture, as a mezzanine level. So if they get a flood warning, everything was moved up there. And very importantly, because of the the depth of flood water, you have 5 or 6 foot of water up against your window, they have their windows braced. It stops the glass from imploding, because I've been to Hebden Bridge and seen lots of windows broken just from the sheer pressure of the water. And those braces actually stopped it from happening. And I want to tell you that they were flooded again in February 2020. But they said it was lovely to talk to her, that it was a depth of just over a foot. So it's nothing, she said, nearly as bad as the 6-foot flood that they'd had in 2015. And due to all the resilient adaptations that she's made, coupled with robust emergency plans, they lost nothing apart from a small amount of packaging. And once they had cleaned up, they were able to open for business in just 3 days. And remember, they were shut for 111 days in the 2015 floods. And they didn't need to make an insurance claim. And one thing I have to flag up is that many businesses, many small businesses at high risk of flooding, cannot get flood insurance. And when they are shut for sometimes up to 6 months, as have been featured in my EMAG, the whole stuffing has been, the community spirit has been taken away from the heart of the community. People can't shop there. People can't be employed. There's a huge financial impact. But because of flood resilient adaptation, trying to keep the water out and making resilient, recoverable repair, businesses, and many of them featured in my EMAG, one of them opened with only 24 hours, have been flooded. So much so that when BBC Breakfast, you love this one, Angela, BBC Breakfast turned up to interview her and said they weren't interested because there was nothing to see. Because she was open and working. And I said, had I been there, I'd have been saying, yes, but this is the story we need to get out to people, not go and see a woe is me, but how we can learn as communities and individual and businesses to make adaptations for when the worst does happen. Thank you very much for listening to me. If we can have the last slide, because I think it's beautiful. It's a beautiful slide, but not when those swans are actually looking in your living room window. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you again for a very enthusiastic presentation. Please do take a look at the EMAG and download it. And if you have any troubles finding it, then please get in touch and we'll be able to share the link with you. But there are some great examples of how businesses in particular, I think, have adapted their properties to withstand the flooding, which, as you've seen from Mary, is made a real difference. So up next, our next speaker is Dermot Keogh from Flood Re, Director of Transition, and he's going to talk to us about a bit about the Flood Re scheme and their transition plans. So Dermot, over to you.
Hello, thank you, Graham. So that's enough excitement for now. We'll now talk about insurance, which should hopefully calm things down a bit. First of all, before we go on, to say a little bit about Northern Ireland. I'm very disappointed we can't actually be meeting there in person. My late partner was a minister of the Northern Ireland office last decade, and I spent many very enjoyable and pleasant weekends in that part of the world, and particularly around Hillsborough. I just I'm very fond of Northern Ireland and looking forward to getting back there again as soon as I can. So let's move on then. This is what I'm going to tell you about briefly in the next 10 minutes or so. A little bit about what is Flood Re, for those of you who may not have heard of us. Secondly, only touch very briefly on what climate change means for us, and then more importantly finish on what Flood Re is doing, what it's responding, and how it's helping promote adaptation to climate change. If we go to the next slide, it's just an example of a painting that was at the exhibit I went to at the V&A at the very front, called "The Future Is Now." And the quote from the French philosopher Paul Varilla that went with it, that said, "The invention of the ship was the invention of the shipwreck." In the same way, the invention of the home or the house was the invention of the flooded house. Without the house, we'd just be talking about muddy fields. So where does insurance come into this? So if you look around over the last couple of decades in response to many of the things we were talking about earlier on climate change. There has been more flooding, it's been more frequent, and it's been more damaging. There's two responses that the insurance industry can take. The first option is to keep pouring money down a black hole and keep just insuring things even though they keep flooding. And the second option is just to stop insuring altogether. So clearly neither of those are desirable outcomes. So this here is Flood Re's purpose. So back in 2014 under the Water Act, the government came together with the insurance industry and came up with Flood Re, a joint initiative, a partnership, and Flood Re's purpose is to promote and enable the availability and affordability of flood insurance, which we are doing. Stay back on the last slide if that's okay. So that's what our day job is, and we do that by taking risks from insurers and passing them on to the global reinsurance market. But the second point, which is where I come in, and my job is around transition. So Flood Re was always designed to be a temporary measure, and by temporary I mean 25 years. So it will only exist until 2039. And after that, we need to transition back to a risk reflective market. So on the next slide here, this is very briefly a simplified operating model for Flood Re. But what I want you to take away from this diagram is essentially that Flood Re sits behind insurers. So that individuals, householders and homeowners buy their insurance as normal through high street insurers or on price comparison sites or through a broker. That insurer then decides whether or not to pass that risk onto Flood Re. Should the worst happen and there's a flood, the individual will go to their insurer as normal, get their claim paid, and then Flood Re will reimburse the insurer. So the next slide. So where does climate change come into all this? Well, obviously, going to 2039, we're looking at things that need to happen in order for Flood Re not to be needed. But all the things that Angela was saying about what climate change means is we're not looking at a static picture. It's like walking up a down escalator, nailing jelly to a ceiling, herding cats. The more that we control flooding, but actually climate change is making the whole of the UK warmer and wetter. This graph here just shows some of the different impacts of some of the different options about the number of properties in the UK at high risk, and this applies to Northern Ireland as well as the rest of the UK. As you know, the target stay on that slide, the target was 2 degrees from the Paris Accord. Angela mentioned it's already at 3 degrees. And if you get to 4 degrees, that's over 2 million homes, extra homes across the UK that would be at high risk of flooding. Currently, it's less than 1 million. So that's more than doubling the number of homes at risk. And the next slide. So this is talking about globally the sort of catastrophes that climate change is causing. Again, Angela referred to the changes that are happening already on global related events. And hopefully you can see this graph. It's just showing, first of all, that the weather related catastrophes are on the increase, and they've increased fourfold in the last 4 years, but the types of them, and clearly their flooding, which is the little blue column, has increased significantly. In the UK, climate change means we will get warmer and wetter. And a lot of what climate change will do is about water, whether it's droughts or flooding, it's about managing that. So next slide, what can Flood Re do and how can Flood Re respond? If you stay on that slide, please, previous one. So essentially, there's only, as Angela pointed out, there's only 2 things you can do in response to climate change. You can mitigate or you can adapt. The mitigation is the net zero stuff, stop producing the carbon dioxide and the greenhouse gases. And that's obviously what net zero and COP26 and so on will be focused on. But the second part of that is about adapting. And again, as Angela very eloquently pointed out, there is already a certain amount of climate change baked in. We are going to see global warming. We are going to see climate change in the UK, even if we stop producing any carbon dioxide tomorrow. So therefore, we need to adapt. And that's where property level flood resilience comes in. The next slide, please. So this is the diagram about what the infographic, if you like, about our transition. So this is what we think needs to happen in the remaining 20 years. So this is talking about here before flood re existed, around 5.3 million homes at risk of flooding, according to the Environment Agency, extrapolated across the UK. If it does flood, as Mary just so vividly illustrated, it's a big deal. It costs a lot of money, tens of thousands of pounds. And before flood re existed, very few people, if they'd been flooded before, could get insurance. Now flood re is here. More than 300,000 homes since our formation in 2016 have at some point benefited from the scheme. And if you have flooded before and you go on a price comparison site, you can get, up to, at least 2 quotes and quite likely up to 10 quotes, and your insurance will be much more affordable. But if we go to the next slide, this talks about what we thought needed to be true, or what we think needs to be true, in order for the insurance market to be able to function without the sort of market intervention represented by flood re. Don't worry about the details on this, what we call our, for obvious reasons, our bucket diagram. But essentially, there's 3 things that we want to happen. The first thing on the left there is reducing the risk of flooding. That means less flooding. So that's about all the investment the government is doing in flood defences. It recently announced another 5.2 billion over the next 6 years into building defences against flooding. But also really, really crucially is not making that situation worse by inappropriate development, building in the wrong areas or building the wrong way. And again, making sure that all homes are built preferably not at risk of flood. And if they are, they have the proper resilience and resistance adaptation. The middle bit is then saying, even when flooding, stop all the flooding you can, and when you can't stop the flooding, it does less damage. Again, as illustrated very powerfully by Mary there at Hebden Bridge, with proper PFR adaptation, the damage that flooding can do will be much, much reduced. And really important on this, so it's not just, as Mary was talking about the measures you put into the property, it's also about, a horrible phrase, the measures you put into the people, but it's about the communities. And communities themselves become resilient. And somewhere like Hebden Bridge, for example, with experience of multiple flooding, people come together, they help each other, they take responsibility as a community for that flooding. And that is really a powerful part of responding to that. And the third bucket there is about achieving an effective market. And that means the insurance industry has to be offering the products that are right for individuals, and people, the public, need to be informed about their flood risk, and really, really crucially about what they can do about it, which I'll come on to in a second. And the UK is quite unique in offering flood insurance as default, as packaged in with regular home insurance. That's something we're very keen to do. So if you go to the next slide, what are some of the things that we're doing about this? So we're doing a lot of things. We're doing a lot of community engagement, but we're doing a lot of research as well on ways that we can incentivize people to take up flooding. And that one on the right there, which I now know is a picture of Karen, which I didn't know that, Mary, till I saw your presentation. So, but there she is, made famous. But that's a document we produced last year that we launched with an event. We're delighted that the minister at DEFRA, the flooding minister, attended that event and spoke about the government's plans for tackling flooding. But the ideas within flood performance certificates, if we go to the next slide, is about an idea that when happens, so this is a sort of mock-up of what it might look like. Let's say like an EPC, for example, but better. But at either point of sale or rent, would gather into one place, both what the risk was the property was facing, so people would know, but really importantly, what's been done to that property to reduce that risk, and therefore, what is the residual, or what's the remaining risk to that property. And then also, really importantly, thirdly, is what further could be done to make that property more resilient, more resistant to future flooding. And one of the problems at the moment is, as Mary alluded to, people have a number of worries around property flood resilience, but one is that it's a form of blight, that it'll mark your home out as being at risk of flooding. But of course, conversely, what we need to do, if we standardise this sort of intervention at the point of either sale or rent, it means actually what we'll be prioritising is what you've done about it, and then hopefully to destigmatise the idea of property flood resilience. And then finally, some other things we're doing, if you go to the next slide, is we're thinking about ideas that how we could change the scheme itself, the flood scheme. So as part of our statute, every 5 years we do a review of ourselves, which we slightly pretentiously call our quinquennial review. And so we looked at parts of the scheme and said, what could we do to make those better? And we made a number of changes and actually sent to the minister. And 6 of those were broadly supported, which we're delighted about. 2 of those I want to highlight for the purposes of today. One is about Build Back Better. And this is about the moment if you're flooded and your home is you have to leave your home. Usually what happens is you're restored to the way, to the state you were before the catastrophe happened. What we'd like to see happening more often in the insurance industry is actually, do they just put you back to where you were before, but they put you back into a better place, to the extent that your property is now more resilient and resistant to future flooding. It just seems to be common sense to us, and we'd like to be able to do that up to a tune of about £10,000 per home. And the second one, discounted premiums, is a bit more of a slow burn. It's a long-term ambition, but we'd also like to, so if Build Back Better can address what's happening after a flood, obviously prevention is better than cure, and it'd be good to incentivize people to put in these measures in their homes before they flood. So the idea is, well, if they've done it already, and a number of people have, that we could reflect or reward that with a reduced premium when you're seated to flood re. There are a number of hurdles to get across, stay on that slide for a second, on that, to achieve that, not least of which some of the case studies, for example, that Mary's talked about. How can we quantify that? And she's done an excellent job of saying what the difference the two might be, but where's the data? How do we know how much benefit that will give? But it's something we want to, I think, in the long term, be able to achieve. And then my final slide, thank you, Chris, is a consultation you can no longer respond to. But DEFRA were consulting on these and some other ideas. The consultation closed on Monday, so don't go to the URL. But there's a number of responses to that. I know some of the people on this conversation have responded, which is great. So we now look forward to the next stage for DEFRA looking at what's come back into that consultation and deciding which ideas to take forward and next. But we're looking forward to working as both with DEFRA and with the insurance industry to hopefully see some of these ideas come to life soon. And I think that's the end. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dermot. So that was a great summary and overview of Flood Re and the transition that's happening there. So I hope that that sort of hit home for you. It was a really good visual visual content in there, I think, about showing the impact of climate change on flooding. So that was nice to see those figures in that chart going up and bringing Angela's talk and Dermot's together very much so there. Just to remind you that you can ask questions. We've got a couple coming in now, which we will get to when we go to the panel discussion, but please do place your questions in the Q&A box if you've got any. And as I said, we'll do our best to get through them all at the end. So I'd now like to introduce you to the next speaker, which is a double act, Ross Jones from DEFRA and Vicky McCausland from the EA. So to kick us off on their conversation, I'm going to pass over to Ross.
Thank you, Graham. Just like to thank, so I'm Ross Jones and I work in DEFRA's Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management team, and I lead on property flood resilience. I'd just like to thank Michelle and Chris and Granier for inviting me to speak here today. And although flooding policy is devolved to Northern Ireland, I thought it would be really helpful to sort of set out the latest developments, set out the policy, the floods policy and PFR policy framework that DEFRA has taken forward. What are the latest developments, and particularly where we can share learnings to help inform any future approach that sort of the Northern Ireland one wants to take in terms of driving up resilience of its communities and its properties. So if you just next slide. So just before we kick up, sort of touching on the drivers, what are the policy drivers driving the need for change in this space? Obviously, climate change. We've heard lots from Angela and also from Dermot. on climate change. Obviously, projections are going to show more intense rainfall and more extreme weather. So since 1998, we've had 6 of the 10 wettest years on record, and obviously this is a trend that's set to continue. And also 2018 UK climate change projections indicate that sea level rise could rise by over 1 metre by the end of the century. Obviously, you've got demographic change. We've got a growing population, which means more homes and infrastructure. Unfortunately, some of those will need to be built on the floodplain and will need to be at risk. There's a need to make them more resilient to flooding. We've got obviously flood defences as one of our primary ways of managing flood risk. Obviously, new defences are needed to better protect more properties, but also the existing defences that are there may be ageing and may require maintenance and repair and/or replacement. And then resilience. I think as our understanding of sort of different methods to protect and prepare against flooding is really developing, and there's an opportunity to really accelerate uptake of those actions over and above just the standard building of defences. Next slide, please. Back in last summer, we published our policy statement, our flood policy statement, and then the EU published their national strategy. This was basically one of the most substantive updates to flood policy in almost a decade, and it really set out our vision for the future with new goals and ways to really drive progress. So what was that goal? It was to sort of create a nation more resilient to future flood and coastal erosion risk, and in doing so, reduce the risk of harm to people, the environment, and the economy. Obviously, we were sort of on that. We sort of set out that we wanted to better protect, we want communities to be better protected to reduce the likelihood of flooding and coastal erosion, and also to be better prepared to reduce the impacts when actually flooding does occur. So within the policy statement, we sort of set out 5 ambitious policies, and also then 40 plus supporting actions that will really drive progress towards that vision. And also all the actions will be taken forward by government. It's not just government, but also really working closely with our partners, such as the Environment Agency and other key stakeholders. And some of these actions might also include changes to legislation. And again, the sort of the policy. Oh, if we can, yeah, that's fine. No, if we can go back one, sorry. I'll tell you when to move on. I think also all the policies are captured in the statement really reflect a lot of development and learning in recent years. That's been informed by a range of experts and evidence we've collected, including evidence that was provided by all the many stakeholders and that from the Committee on Climate Change. And also it's worth mentioning that at the same time, the Environment Agency published their delivery strategy to really help guide the activities of risk management authorities on the ground, and how we will both deliver the policy statement and also their national risk management strategy. Okay, next slide. So just to really touch on what were the key policies within the policy statement. So the first one was obviously upgrading and expanding our national flood defences and infrastructure, where we've committed to doubling the investment in defences by up to £5.2 billion over the next 6-year period, and that's hopefully going to better protect over 330,000 homes and businesses. The second one is sort of taking action to better manage the flow of water more effectively, and by that, one of the ways of doing that is by increasing the number of water management schemes across catchments to really help reduce flood risk, and also at the same time to help manage drought risk. How can we better store water so we can store it and it can be used at times of drought. The third one is sort of harnessing the power of nature to reduce flood and coastal erosion risk and achieve multiple benefits. And I think as part of that is really important to help enhance our understanding and drive action to tackle surface water flooding. The fourth action is to sort of better prepare communities, and I'll touch on that in my next slide because that's obviously the key focus of the conference today. And then the sort of fifth key policy area is enabling more resilient places through a more catchment-based approach. By this we mean we want to sort of consider a full range of actions which could be taken in an area both upstream and downstream, by a variety of bodies. So we're not only thinking about individual flood defences or properties, but we're looking at a whole area from both source to sea. Next slide, please. Best preparing communities, sort of the fourth policy area that I mentioned. What's our vision in this space? So we really want to ensure that communities and businesses have the information that they need to sort of better manage and prepare for their flood risk. And obviously being better prepared means that they can respond and recover quicker, particularly as we've heard from and demonstrated by the ability of PFR by Mary in her presentation. And also we want to take action that will really help to limit the damage and destruction that flooding causes. And just some of the actions we set out in the policy statement to achieve that was in particular taking steps to try and guide the design and location of new development. Also to ensure buildings and infrastructure and key public services are better prepared, and also really taking action to better support communities so they are able to respond quicker and also to recover quicker. Next slide, please. So as we heard from Mary, there are times, despite the investment we make in flood defences, there are places where these aren't appropriate, and then also there's times at floods where these defences may be overtopped, and this is where property flood resilience can really play a key role. So we've heard again, as we've heard from Mary, there's sort of resilience measures fall into two categories. There's resistance measures, which are keeping the water out, such as flood doors, flood barriers, and air brick covers. But then there's also those recoverability measures. So when the water does come in, it has to come into a property. Having measures in place that enable that property to recover quicker. So things like non-return valves in your toilet, concrete floors with tile floors. Lots of waterproof plastering, the use of sump pumps. There's a long list of measures that can be deployed to again help you return quicker. I think again, sort of, can we stay on that one? Thinking, I think the right design and the use of materials is really important, and it really can create homes and businesses that can be brought back into use a lot quicker after a flood. And also the Environment Agency's long-term investments scenarios published in 2019 show that damages really could be reduced by up to a quarter if all residential properties at flood risk were made flood resilient. And also we know that PFR is cost effective for a large number of homes, and actually you could reduce risk by around 16%. Next slide, please. So apologies for this somewhat busy slide, but I think it just sort of gives I'm going to quick overview of the sort of policy, the PFR policy framework that's in place that both DEFRA and the Environment Agency drive forward. So at the same time as the insurance consultation that Dermot announced, we also published a call for evidence, which sort of sets out a number of enablers that are needed to drive the uptake of PFR, and I'll touch on that in my next slide. As you know, we've also got the flood reinsurance scheme, which provides subsidised insurance to those at flood risk, which is great. And as Dermot mentioned, we're also consulting on changes to the scheme to be able to introduce the provision of Build Back Better, i.e. funding properties to have PFR installed after a flood for properties that accede to the scheme, but also looking to provide reduced premiums. And again, the consultation on that has just closed, and we will be sort of analysing those responses and responding in due course. We've also got our grant in aid scheme, the partnership funding scheme, which essentially is the sort of main driver for deploying all the funding, the 5.2 billion pounds funding that I've mentioned, which is mainly there to deploy defences. However, through that funding, we are also able to fund PFR. And I think also, so through that, only houses that are really significant risk, very significant risk, can be supported through that. But we are, through our call for evidence, sort of taking views on whether the eligibility criteria for PFR support under the grant and aid scheme should be expanded to those that are at significant risk. We've also got PFR repair schemes, which are deployed during major flooding events or just after major flooding events, to be provided to those households and SMEs and businesses, to enable them to sort of build back better after the flood. However, the one in sort of England is only deployed during or just after a flood, whereas sorry, someone just come up and say, can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? where was I? Sorry. Can you hear me, everyone? Sorry, someone just said they couldn't hear me.
I can still hear you.
Excellent, thank you, Graham. However, so we have our PFR scheme, which I was mentioning, we only deploy during a flood, whereas I know there's one in the Northern Ireland is available year round for people that are at high risk, and provide grant funding of up to £10,000 to make your property more resilient. Also in March 2020, the government also announced a £200 million innovation scheme, which was will help 25 local areas to take forward wider innovative actions to improve their resilience to flooding and coastal erosion, and this would include PFR. And we recently announced the successful projects last month. And there's also we have something called the Pathfinder projects, which are being delivered by the Environment Agency, where we funded around £3 million to projects in Yorkshire, the South West, and in the Oxford-Cambridge Arc. And the aim of these Pathfinders is to really raise the benefits of PFR through in these areas through demonstration centres and advice portals, and through engagement and through local business. Okay, next slide, please. So it's just not, but it's not just government that can really that needs to take action in this space. I think it's the responsibility of sort of improving the resilience of communities is sort of, it's not just it's not just government, but it's everyone. It's local government, and it's also wider industry. And there's loads of great work that wider industry have been doing to sort of drive PFR uptake. So back in 2015, the then Floods Minister Rory Stewart commissioned Dr. Peter Bonville to bring together key stakeholders together in a round table to really consider how collectively we can best enable and encourage the use of property flood resilience. And it's fair to say the round table has been excellent. It's been instrumental in really driving and shaping the actions necessary to increase uptake and to improve installation standards over the last 5 to 6 years. So just to touch on some of their key achievements. One of the key achievements of the round table is the delivery of the Code of Practice on PFR delivery, which was published by Syria last year. And this really provides sort of 6 standards, setting out the best practice on how to assess the flood risk of properties, how to design design for the measures that need to be installed, sort of the best practice around the level of standards for installation, and then also maintenance. And this code of practice, embedding this code of practice sort of across surveyors and installers is actually vital in terms of driving up standards, to make sure that the PFR is installed is right for that property, and works and does the job that it needs to do. And it also will, by embedding the code of practice, will help sort of address some of the problems that the industry have faced in previous years, around the quality of installations. And you'll be hearing a lot more about that from the Environment Agency and from CIWEM after myself. And also the roundtable has also been instrumental in bringing about voluntary standards. In particular, BS 8500, which is a standard developed to provide guidance to architects, engineers, and developers on the suitable materials and construction techniques for improving resistance and resilience of buildings. And there's also BS 851188, which again is a voluntary standard for flood-resistant products, and also BSI provide an accreditation service for those products. Just moving on to the last slide. So what are the next steps for driving PFR uptake? So I think it's fair to say government recognises that we do, given the increased risk from climate change, we do need to bring about a step change in PFR uptake. I mean, ideally, we want PFR to be a sort of self-sustaining market in the absence of government support. And also, and as we've heard from Dermot, the PFR has a real key role to play in helping to transition to a risk reflective market where insurers recognise the role that PFR can play in reducing the cost of payouts in the event of a flood, and sort of getting to recognise that how effective it can be, and then subsequently reducing their premiums accordingly. So I think there's a number of, as I mentioned earlier, we published a call for evidence earlier this year, which is really seeking views on a number of enablers that we think need to be made effective that could really help drive the uptake of PFR. I think, and just to really quickly touch on them, I think one of those areas is comms and understanding. What information do property owners need to, one, understand their flood risk and all the action they can take to address that risk? Evidence and data sharing, as I've mentioned, there's a lack of information around efficacy of PFR and its ability to allow people to recover quickly and reduce the cost of claims after a flood. So how do we make that information readily available and openly available? Planning and policy, what could we do in sort of in front planning policy and in building regulations to sort of again embed PFR and make sure PFR becomes a feature of new builds and any renovations. Training and expertise, as I mentioned previously, there's been some issues around the quality of installations and maybe the quality of surveying. So how do we drive up skills within the surveying and installation standards, in installation sectors? And there's already been some great work being done by EA and CIWEM on that, which you'll hear about after me. And also finally, and lastly, finance incentives. What additional incentives or support could potentially government provide to, I'd say, really sort of drive sort of a step change in the uptake of PFR? So that call for evidence is now closed, and a number of you and the people on the panel have responded, and we'll be analysing all those responses and responding in due course. As Dermot mentioned, we've also had the flood re-consultation on changes to the flood re-scheme. As he mentioned, introducing Build Back Better and reduce premiums. Again, that consultation is now closed. We'll be analysing responses and again responding in due course. And we're also about to undertake an evaluation of our PFR repair scheme to understand how that, a process and impact evaluation to really understand how that could be perhaps better delivered in the future to really help communities and again drive uptake. So that's it for me. I'm now going to hand over to Vicky McCausland from the Environment Agency, who will touch on all the great work they're doing on property flood resilience. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, Ross, and hi everybody. So yes, I'm Vicky McCausland from the Environment Agency. I am the senior advisor in our National Asset Standards and Engineering team, and I'm probably one of the only lucky people in the Environment Agency that really has one piece of work to focus on, and that is around how we can mainstream and better deliver PFR. As Ross has nicely touched on, obviously we have the policy statement from DEFRA around how we need to drive forward with property flood resilience. And now it's how ourselves as an organisation can work across the sector to really mainstream PFR as a solution to flooding. So I'm going to take us through really, really quickly some of the initiatives that we are currently leading on. And then I'll go forward to talk a little bit about the PFR framework, which is a significant portion of my work at the moment. So in terms of our current initiatives, this slide really summarises the key ones that we are working on at the moment. A number of them will be discussed in different presentations today. So Ross has nicely looked at the kind of policy, strategy and governance side of things. Skills and training will be talked about later as well. And we've talked a little bit around the funding approaches. So I'm going to focus on some of our behavioural change work, the data management side of PFR, and then asset management as well. So we'll just move on to the next slide. Thank you. So behavioural change, this is a huge element of PFR. A lot of people have talked about how we can increase take-up. So some of the work that we've been doing recently is a lot of research around what actually are the blockers for the take-up of PFR. And a lot of times you hear that people don't understand what it is, they don't understand how it could work for them. You tend to see a lot of negative press around the solutions. And some of the work that Mary and others have been involved with around really getting case studies out there to say, this is how it can work and these are the benefits, have been really instrumental in moving people's thought processes forward. And I guess in terms of take-up, what's really interesting is actually the national average take-up for government-led schemes is around 70%. We do have some good examples where we've hit, say, 85% in the Middle Medway area and 97% in some places in Yorkshire. It really shows that even when you have schemes that are led by organisations, probably paid for by organisations, homeowners still aren't taking up the option. So it's really thinking about, well, how can we improve that? And Ross mentioned the Pathfinders. So this is a huge initiative that kind of came around April 2019. More than £3 million was put forward by DEFRA, and we've obviously been working to help deliver that. When I say we were doing the work, in reality, it is the individual pathfinders themselves. So we're working with the organisations in Yorkshire, Oxford, Cambridge and the Devon areas to really think about how do we engage with people. It's a huge issue. COVID has really, really not helped in that, and a lot of work has obviously had to go online as we have done today. The feedback and the information that we're getting from the Pathfinders is amazing. So they all have their own websites, they're all creating information that is available to organisations, individuals, to really help explain what the solutions are and how they can help them. Really excitingly, there are mobile vehicles in some locations that have been delivered. And there's an excellent, we can send links out afterwards, but there's some excellent videos to kind of show you what those are. This should be enabling us to actually get out to communities. I've done lots of public events in the past with photographs of products. This is a solution that we're putting on somebody's home. They need to understand it. They need to touch and feel things. You wouldn't buy a sofa without going and having a look at it to see what the colour's like in reality. People really need to get out and touch and feel products, and these mobiles that are coming out of the Pathfinders will really help that. Other things that they are also doing is really researching different ways of engaging with people. We will see examples of flooded homes being developed, so people can actually go and see again what the products could look like. There's lots of videos available via YouTube that really help bring the solution to life. So the Pathfinders really are critical for us to understand what is it that is preventing people take up PFR. We need to move towards a PFR solution, be it a door, a barrier, an air brick, seen as important to somebody as their fire alarm on their ceiling. You'll have your fire alarm, you'll press it every now and again to make sure it works. It's a standard thing people have, and that's where we need to move to. So this research piece and some of the outputs that we're getting via the Pathfinders really are helping us moving forward. If we move on to the next slide, with so much going on, data management is critical. And one of the things that is being developed at the moment with Cywim and Watertight is really having a look at a data management platform. What we've got to be really mindful of is, as a government organisation, we are evidence-based. We need to understand what we're delivering and where we need to justify our expenditure. So having something where we can store information of delivery will help us deliver our strategic overview role. We know what's being delivered and where. We can do lessons learned, reporting requirements, all from a central tool that will store all our information. At the moment, everything's quite ad hoc. So something as simple as pulling a report together can actually be quite time consuming. This needs to be embedded in our day-to-day practice. By having effective data management through a portal that people can access, it's really, really going to help us moving forward. And the data platform itself that is being developed at the moment really does look at kind of what is being delivered and where. And it's a platform that can be used by multiple organisations. So I know it's going to be touched on the code of practice in one of our later presentations, but the standards that are set within there are also embedded within the platform. And what it would allow in terms of security is, if you are a recognised appropriate person for that standard, you can have access to the data. You'd be able to go in and you could see where schemes have been put in the past. We would be able to think about that long-term management and maintenance of products. We will be able to, say, suppliers delivering the work, they will be able to do their project management with this system. So it'd be incredibly important. Actually, I think longer term, really important in terms of asset management. These are assets that we're putting on people's homes, and therefore maintenance and operation is critical. So having something that would be able to flag when a product is potentially coming to the end of its life would be incredibly helpful for our long-term capital programs. But also things like when you bob into Boots or other companies and you see posters on doors to say there's a product recall, that we have a problem with a particular product. This data management tool would allow that to happen really quickly. We'll be able to actively manage what is being delivered locally. The data management really is key around the delivery of our scheme property for resilience. And if we can move on to the next slide, it really picks up on the asset management and delivery a little bit more. Obviously, within my role, I'm really looking at the standards of delivery. Working with BSI, we obviously have height marks in the new British Standard, BS 1188, that is in place for products such as your doors and your barriers. And it's critical that we use products that we know have been tested to that appropriate standard. To do that, we're also looking at the procurement framework at the moment. So the Environment Agency has a procurement framework that is available, and I will touch on that in more detail. And really importantly, a piece of work that we're starting to think about is that life cycle asset management piece. In that at the moment, it feels very much that once a scheme has been delivered, we walk away, we hand over to the homeowner, and then we leave. But we have to start thinking about how do we manage products in the long term. And that data management tool that I talked about is really important to be able to do that. The standards are critical, warranties are critical as well. I've put a thing up there around thinking about that longer term warranty on products, again, are critical for PFR because of the importance of maintenance. A lot of failures we see in the product is down to poor installation and poor maintenance by the end user, and we really need to think about that. So the work that we're doing is looking at extending the warranty periods on products. And I wanted to touch upon really quickly how we're looking at the delivery. So if we just go back to that last slide, if that's possible, I'm just going to pick up on there on the 6-year DEFRA Capital Programme. So the programme itself is actually highlighting over 160 pure PFR schemes across the country, which is huge for our delivery framework. So over £45 million worth of investment in PFR schemes alone via our capital programme. And I think quite importantly, particularly given the kind of flood risk that you see in Northern Ireland, 40% of those schemes are for surface water delivery. So only around 55% of schemes themselves are being delivered by the Environment Agency. A lot of them are actually being delivered by our lead local flood authorities, with a heck of a lot for surface water. So over 2,000 properties will be better protected from surface water flooding by our capital programme. If we go on to the next kind of section, what I want to do now is really focus on that framework, because this is a fundamental change that is happening over in England at the moment that I want to touch on today. So on the next slide is a real kind of where we are at the moment. So as I've mentioned, we do have a procurement framework in place at the moment. It came into play back in 2018 and does run through to 2022. It's available across the whole of the United Kingdom. I know it has been used in Wales, and it's open to all risk management authorities. It isn't just an Environment Agency piece, it's something that can be used by the water companies, lead local authorities and others as well. It's got 8 suppliers on there at the moment, so obviously the image on the side there identifies the different lots that are available on the framework, ranging from supply through all the way to the installation side of things. In terms of benefits, we can have direct award below £25,000, and it provides that national consistency. However, and on to the next slide, there really is a case for change. We've talked today about actually this is PFR, although it isn't a new solution, the sector is emerging and it's changing very, very quickly. We've had the introduction of the Syria Code of Practice and also the new British standards, and we really need to ensure that they're embedded within our framework. People have talked around what actually PFR is, and that it isn't just resistance, it isn't just thinking doors, barriers, let's stop the water coming in. It's recognising that water is likely to still enter a property. There could be situations where barriers are overtopped. So recoverability is key as well, and that will be embedded within the new framework. And really important is the customer focus. Again, I've mentioned we are doing something directly onto someone's property. We really need to take into account what the end user's needs are. And then the last one on there is this kind of easy to use procurement frameworks. I'm not a procurement specialist. The feedback I get is it can be a nightmare. So we need to make sure that the procurement process is quick, it's easy, and people can access the framework swiftly, particularly straight after a flood. If we move on to the next slide, this is really setting out what our proposals are for the new framework. We've been doing a lot of collaboration. This isn't just myself sat in a room designing the new framework to move forward. we're working with people across the sector to really learn from the existing framework and where we want to be longer term. And like I say, things are moving fast. This is literally hot off the press. Developed this, I think it was on Monday, following some feedback from a pre-tender survey looking at what market there is out there for suppliers. And we're actually looking at reducing down to 2 lots by the next framework. The first one would be having a look at standards 1, 2 and 5 of the Code of Practice. So looking at the kind of the hazard assessment and the survey, and then the audit process at the end. And actually really importantly is also this role of an overview. So somebody that is always there, the whole process, to understand and in a sense check that the whole solution that is being identified is the right solution. So that it always goes back to that hazard assessment and the end user needs. Are we better protecting a property in terms of how that property floods and what the homeowner or the property owner needs? The second lot is then around more detailed design. So where we identify resistance as being a solution, we would have suppliers that can come and do optioneering and detailed designs, the kind of the standards 3 and the standards 4, where they would then do the installation work. And it's about collaboration. At the moment, the framework isn't at a national level, but we're looking at moving towards hubs. So the image there is our proposal of 4 hubs. I think the benefit of this with England is that, like I say, the PFR is becoming a bigger solution now, and our program is growing, and we really need to think about how we can deliver that. So by moving to hubs, we would have potentially 3 or 4 suppliers on them. We would be able to have better confidence in delivery. We'll have better collaboration. So we'll be able to think, how do we deliver within the hub? What is our vision for the future, so that we know that we can have a pipeline of projects moving forward, so that we can support communities more. What we need to do now by moving to hubs is think, well, what does that mean for Northern Ireland? The framework itself will still be available. And what we need to think about is, well, how will you deliver the framework? It could be that there is a hub for Northern Ireland and a separate tender process. These are the discussions that we need to have to really think, how could we make the framework available and easy to deliver within Northern Ireland? So we've got a little bit of work to do with that to confirm those. But like I say, this is very, very hot off the press. So if we move on to your next slide, this is really just to kind of confirm very quickly what the context would be for the new framework, which is about embedding the code of practice. The Environment Agency fully supports the outputs of the code, and so therefore that will be the basis for developing the framework. Importantly, it will have gateways. So when we get to the end of each of the standards, there will be a gateway in criteria to meet before you can go on to the next part of the process. We've talked about resistance and recoverability being critical to PFR, that it isn't just doors, barriers, air, but it's about stopping water. It's going to start asking those questions. Are we sure resistance is the right way to go? Or do we need to think purely recoverability, or is it a joint requirement? But I also want to throw preparedness in there. There's no point having products and solutions in place if you don't know when to put them into play, if you don't know how to respond and recover afterwards. Preparedness is actually really important. And when I say preparedness, I'm talking flood warnings, I'm talking having emergency plans in place, actually thinking when you have a solution, how will you prepare to deliver that when required? The British standard for flood products will be a requirement of the framework. At the moment, we talk about either having the existing, which is PAS 1188, or tested to the standard of. Tested to the standard of is proposed to be completely removed, and it will require certification of BS 85 1188 for flood resilience products. As I've touched on, warranties will be extended further. At the moment, it's only 1 year. We are going to go higher than that. And again, it's to give confidence to homeowners that their products are going to work when required. And importantly, we're going to introduce an installation and monitoring process. We know that a lot of the reasons products are failing or the solution is failing is because installation is poor. We need to get a handle of that. We need to get it right so that the homeowners aren't still seeing their properties flooding because of poor craftsmanship. And handover, as I say, we hand over a product to the homeowner. We don't want to walk away and leave them where they don't know what they're doing. The handover process needs to be a lot clearer and a lot more simple for the homeowners. And to go on to the last slide is really a bit of a summary of everything that we're doing. And this is about, if we can just move on, thank you. So this really sets out what it is that we're trying to achieve. The code of practice gives us a process. The standards from BSI gives us confidence in a product. And we also have the new training that is being developed by SIWEM around the appropriate person to do the work. So collectively, we have confidence in what we're delivering. Pulling all those together via the framework gives us the opportunity to then deliver consistently and to a high standard across the country. Out of the end of the framework, we get quality evidence solutions, installation and handover. We know what we are giving to the homeowner is the best solution we possibly can. And by bringing it together into a data tool, we can actively monitor and manage schemes moving forward. And in an ideal world, we'd be able to press a very special button at the end of the process via the data management tool that would say, we have the quality control and we are certified. We know that what you have had installed is the correct solution for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vicky, and to Ross for an excellent summary of what's happening at government level. And just to pick up on a couple of points there, you said the behavioural change is really, really key, and it drives everything really, is encouraging people to take up PFR. And the database is something that the Roundtable have been looking at for some time, and it's a challenge, but it is getting there, and it's lovely to see that that's actually forming part of that structure in the framework, because that will drive confidence not only to people but also to insurers that PFR is starting to make a difference. So thank you very much for that, Vicky and Ross. Our final speaker of the day is Alistair Chisholm from SIWEM, where I'm sure we are going to build on that now around the standards and the code and hear more about that. So Alistair, if I can hand over to you, please.
Thanks, Graham. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all right? I'm Alistair Chisholm. I'm Director of Policy at SIWEM. As a professional institution, clearly professional competence and standards is right at the forefront of what we do. So that's really what I'm going to talk to you about. The benefit of being the final speaker here is that a lot of the previous speakers have touched on quite a lot of the content in my talk, which is great. So hopefully I can canter through this quite quickly, and that will leave a little bit more time for discussion. So if we can have the next slide, please. Just to reiterate, PFR is one tool in the toolbox for flood risk management. There's a kind of a hierarchy, if you like, of interventions that range from real hard engineered traditional flood defense schemes all the way down to basically doing nothing. And as Ross said, it can be a really cost-effective intervention where there is residual flood risk or flood risk that there aren't any other means of protection and resilience available other than PFR. And over the next couple of slides, obviously here on the right-hand side, sorry, if you can just jump back. On the right-hand side, you've got the resistance, the main resistance measures, and again Ross touched on what those are: your air bricks, your floodboards, and non-return valves and such like. If we can go on to the next slide, again, Mary showed you a range of case study examples of these kind of interventions, and again, Ross mentioned the fact that there is a really long list of different interventions that can be applied to a property to enhance its resilience. And I think the takeaway from this slide, and if we go on to the next one, you can see it in a kitchen setting, is that there is this wide range of interventions, and then you have to consider that every single property is different. Even a row of terraced homes over time very, very likely to have been modified in some way, shape or form, which will affect their vulnerability to flooding. They may have been maintained to different standards, and their topographical context might be slightly different, so that water will flow differently around them. So what that translates through to is that you need a high degree of professionalism to assess the risks and to set out the recommendations for the most effective combination of interventions that can be applied to that property. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Again, Ross touched on the Property Flood Resilience Roundtable and the action plan, so I won't really talk too much about that, other than to say that that was the main instigator of the current suite of standards, I think, that we are seeing being developed and now being translated through training, certification and assurance. He also talked around the Pathfinder projects, just trying to increase the uptake of an awareness of PFR. So if we can move on to the next one, please. PFR has been around for a long time. Mary mentioned that she put in interventions into her house 20 years ago. It's not a new technology as such. And also there have been standards out there for quite a long time as well. Back in 2013, there was some guidance put out for local authorities and professionals called the 6 Steps to Flood Resilience. And that was really the first point at which the emphasis was put on the fact that PFR is a process and there were various stages to it. And that's something that you'll see in due course is picked up in the code of practice. But despite there were BSI kite mark schemes around for well over 10 years, and as Vicky said, those have been updated recently, but despite the presence of that guidance, of those kite marks, you were still seeing poor quality installations. You may have had a kite marked flood barrier installed onto a property, but if you see on the right hand side that being installed right next to a hole in a wall is absolutely useless. Likewise, if the frame for a barrier is not properly fixed to the wall, because the wall maybe is not fully linear, the standard of installation is as critical as the performance of the product itself. And the two need to go absolutely hand in hand. And that's where the work that we're doing comes in. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So through the PFR roundtable, one of the key outputs and activities was the development of the code of practice. So that kicked off around 2016, supported by ourselves, by the Institute of Civil Engineers and the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, and financially supported by Aviva, the Environment Agency, and the various devolved governments. Took quite a while to develop. It's a detailed piece of guidance, but it builds on these 6 phases. So there's basically you start around the hazard assessment piece, which then flows into the property level surveys. Out of that should fall an options development phase. You'll then move on to the construction and installation, then commissioning and handover, which is vital because that's central to the property occupier understanding how the technologies that have been installed into their property actually work and should be maintained. And then the final stage, which is also critical, and Vicky touched on this, around reasons for failure, is ensuring that over time those interventions are properly maintained, that the occupier knows how to use them. And those 6 standards are very much the foundation for the code of practice. The standards set out in very sort of high level terms what must be delivered for each of those stages, and then there's a prescribed process which will guide the relevant professionals who are doing that phase of the work through effectively a flowchart of steps that they have to deliver in order to deliver that phase appropriately. And all of that is underpinned by detailed technical guidance, but also higher level guidance for property owners, both homeowner and business, and planners as well. because they're an important stakeholder. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Mentioned the BS standards, the kite mark standards, and the publicly available standard has been modified and updated into a fully blown British standard, which is great to see. You can find more information on that on the British Standards website, so I won't touch on that anymore. If we can move on to the next one. All of these standards are fine, but the delivery against them is critical. And one of the challenges for the industry over the years, certainly when it was very much a nascent industry, was that the standards of practice sometimes left quite a lot to be desired, and so you were seeing relatively high levels of failure of installation during flood events, and that greatly concerned people within the industry because it was undermining the trust in what they were trying to do. So around the production of the code of practice, we wanted to find out, how extensively people had been trained within the industry and what appetite there was out there for people to be trained in the new requirements of the code of practice. So we did some survey work, a gap analysis piece for the Environment Agency over last summer. And I just flag up some of the headlines from that survey. We asked people how much, whether or not they'd been trained. And just under 70% said that they hadn't received any training at all. About 16% said that they had received training, but that was in-house training provision by their employer, so that they were clearly working with installer companies and being trained through that means. And then there was about 14% who had received training provided on the open market. If we could move on to the next slide, please. And one of the key reasons why that's important, I think, is summed up by this quote. And it's from a surveyor who said that they undertake surveys, but they're very commonly asked by homeowners how they became qualified to do that survey work in relation to PFR. And whilst they might be highly qualified surveyors and have sufficient flood risk knowledge, they didn't have any formal evidence that they had been trained to that effect. So consequently, there's a high demand for more training that will end up in a formal recognition of professionals' competence in this field. If we can move on to the next one, please. Just did an analysis, as I said, of what training is out there on the open market. Don't know how well you can read this slide, but basically all you need to see is that the columns in that table are the 6 standards of the code of practice, and the green blocks are training products that cover the range of subject matter that's relevant to that standard, may or may not be updated at that point in time to cover the exact detailed technical content of the code, but would be readily updatable. So as a proportion of the whole sort of suite of need for training, then the provision on the open market for professionals working in our sector is not great. If we can have the next slide, please. So the Environment Agency picked up on this and put out a tender for the development of some training that will effectively fill those gaps. We put a bid in with a range of partners to cover off the necessary skills, professional skills in the sector. Happily, we were successful in that bid, and we're now busy developing training for basically 3 audiences. The first being those professionals who are working out there on the ground doing delivery of PFR schemes. That's the bulk of the suite of training. There's also a separate package being developed for Environmental Agency employees, and then another one at a slightly higher level that's being developed for other risk management authorities. All of this training will be supported by the development of a community of practice. So any professionals who have gone through that training can get access through effectively a knowledge hub to any new events, any new standards, or thought leadership. Also probably feature discussion forums so that people can share experiences, and that will be maintained by us. we're also going to develop a register of certified professionals. So when industry professionals go through the training, they will be required to undertake an initial skills assessment to ensure that they have the requisite foundation knowledge to be able to do the training in the first place. And at the end of the training, they will have the option to undertake an endpoint assessment, which, if they pass, will enable them to go onto a register of certified professionals. And Vicky mentioned the term appropriate person. This is a term defined by the Code of Practice, basically setting out for the various standards, the kind of professional competence that should be required by any of the professionals doing work against each of the phases. If we can have the next slide, please. So there were six stages to PFR effectively. If you think about the delivery of the scheme, there's many stages. If we're thinking about the road from various sets of standards, not only the Code of Practice, all the way through to a fully assured process, which should enable end users, particularly insurers, to be reassured that schemes that are developed, are installed, are done at an appropriate level of quality, so that the benefits of that PFR can be reflected in more affordable premiums in the long term. Various components of that journey are either have been done, i.e. the Code of Practice, or in train, which are the ones that are shown as yellow. I should probably include the flood performance certificates within that, because that's a piece of work that Flood Re is supporting and is ongoing. We're building the training. We're building the register for the certified competent professionals. And Vicky touched on the database, and that's the means by which we provide that robust audit trail. Unless insurers and other end users can interrogate what has been done on the ground, be able to see the evidence that it has been done appropriately, robustly, professionally, then they're not going to be able to reflect that in premiums. So if we can just move on to my final slide, please. So that database, you had that screenshot from Vicky. She explained really how it's going to work. The whole point is that when a professional or practitioner is out there on the ground working on a property, it will be a step-by-step process whereby they will undertake one of the phases of the process that is set out underneath the Code of Practice. They will not be able to progress to the next one or to the next standard of the Code of Practice until each of the requirements has been satisfied. Each of the areas of evidence has been uploaded to that platform, to that database. It will be run through iPads and will feed into a central database that will be able to be interrogated by various end users, including the Environment Agency, the insurance sector. We're calling it the Flood Compliance Platform. It's being developed development started autumn last year. It's going to be running across this year, tested increasingly widely through the sector, and hopefully we'll be able to open it up for widespread use in 2022. So I think at that point, that's all I have to say. I was asked to comment on the implications of this for practitioners in Northern Ireland. I think the fundamental thing to say is this is all about professional standards, approaches, and those apply throughout the United Kingdom, probably internationally as well. So I don't really think there's too much difference really for professionals in Northern Ireland to anywhere else in the UK.
Thank you, Alistair. Thanks for that. A really good reminder there around the importance of getting a more consistent approach to training and the standards. We are fast running out of time, but I want to move on to some questions that we've got in the Q&A section and in the chat. So first of all, if I could kick off with those, and I'll get through as many of these as we can, and if we can't cover them all, then we'll make sure we get the responses out to anything that's left outstanding. So, Angela, I'm going to come to you first, if I could. You've been patiently waiting since speaking first, so I'll bring you back in. Who and how do we talk to the public more about climate change impacts? And also, there's some questions in the Q&A box as well that I think you've probably seen around peatlands cover. So, can you comment on any of those points, please?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And it's been fascinating today. So I hope everyone's enjoyed it as much as I have. The key thing is that to get this message out, we have to tell people where they get their information from, which is primarily the media and their community peers as well. So it's about engaging with journalists. It's about people who have a platform and a voice, and that changes constantly with all these celebrities and Insta famous people. It often frightens me that my friend who posts pictures of her home and her pillows has 100,000 followers on Instagram. So I don't care who gets the message out there, so long as we can get the message out there. And so the media, particularly since COVID, have actually lost so many journalists, especially like local regional media, which are the foundations of our communities, really. So the more we can give stories packaged up, ready for people, journalists to use, that the easier we make their job, the more likely they are to cover this story. But this is a news thing. This is a home building features issue. You know, with COVID, we've seen so many people wanting to leave cities and move to the countryside, you know, so there's the whole sort of property market's gone crazy. There's so many sort of opportunities to get the message out there about flooding, but really the people that influence them the most, so it's the message, but also the messenger, are the people they know and trust. So it's reaching people, but reaching them with a message that resonates, because the human ability to deny how big a risk this is unbelievable. I live in just on the edge of the Somerset levels, which many of you might know flooded quite badly, and some homes and villages were under water for months, not just days or weeks, but months. And even now, there was a feature on Countryfile interviewing one of the women, and she had put back white carpets because she believed it would never happen again. So getting that message out there is so important. And just on the environmental stories, just very quickly, that people asked, digging up peat bog is bonkers. In lockdown, gardening went up twice. Peat is a great carbon store. We have to make peat legal and restore our peatlands and our woodlands, and that's both nationally and internationally. So there's no point us offshoring the problem, if you see what I mean. So bringing in soya from Brazil or peat from other countries, from East Europeans. So that's all around legislation and environmental standards. Hopefully that's answered that question.
Thank you, Angela. I'm going to shoot now across to, I think a couple of you might want to come in here, but Dermot, I'm going to come to you on it because it's kind of key. And Mary, I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. So we've got, could the insurance industry do more to encourage PFR? And I guess you might want me to comment on this one as well. And how effective has creating flood performance certificates been in supporting that? And then we had another question, so apologies while you think about that one. We had a question around the cost of PFR and what does it cost to make a property more resilient. So Dermot, what's your view on the insurance industry and how they're seeing PFR at the moment? Probably crucial with the consultation that's out there at the moment. Have we got Dermot? Or we lost Dermot?
Am I on mute? Sorry.
Oh, yep.
First reply. I won't be able to better that. So the question, could the insurance industry do more? The answer is yes. And I think we can all do more. So that's not to single out the insurance industry. There's a lot more I think we can all do in this space. I mean, we're not very much hoping. We are currently talking with insurers. And at the end of the process that Ross described, and when we have whatever changes come out of the scheme for that, we're really keen to work with insurers. Because ultimately, although maybe the flood scheme, for example, that can offer Build Back Better, it's insurers who will deliver that. I mean, they're the ones who'll have the policies with individual policyholders. They're the ones that'll have to implement and deliver build back better on the ground. So yes, there is. I think insurers recognise that, and we're talking together about how to do it. I touched on as well, and goes into the next question, I suppose, around FPCs. I mean, FPCs haven't arrived yet. They're still at a sort of idea stage, and there's so many things we need to have in place to make FPCs credible and useful. So we need to be able to, so the code of practice is a really important first step, and all the measures that Alistair and Victoria were talking about to give a real structure to it. We also need to be able to score and understand and articulate what the benefit of PFR is on an individual property. I mean, I'm hoping the flood relief scheme, obviously, because we are a collaboration between government and insurance industry, can sort of preempt some of that, because we don't necessarily have to demonstrate the benefit, but we can start some of those processes going. So far the reception of FPCs has been very good. I think there's a number of different things going on. The work that Alistair talked about, the work that Victoria talked about, and the work that the Resilience Roundtable is talking about and doing a scoring project, which I think will help embed all those things and make them become a reality. Does that answer the question, Graham?
Yeah, I think that's fine, Dermot. Thank you very much. There was just one sub question on that around the cost. So, Mary, I don't know whether you want to just very quickly give a view. You speak to an awful lot of people around the country, as you've shown out of your emails and that. And I know it's a very difficult question to answer because every property is different, and every property has a specification that's specific to that property. But typically, what do you see people investing in PFR that's really making a difference?
Well, of course, some of them can be cost neutral. For instance, if you put your plaster horizontally, and then you can just, that will be the same cost as putting it in normal way. And so if you get flooded, you can just remove off the lower level of the plaster and replace it. So it doesn't cost very much at all. And also raising your plug sockets up the wall at time of repair don't have to cost anymore. And flood resilient plaster, waterproof plaster, only costs a few pounds extra. So that kind of thing can be cost neutral. I think I said that Martin's work, he said cost about £15,000, and so did Karen's work, cost about £15,000. Obviously, if you're having a complicated membrane system fitted where the water can come through the wall, go behind the membrane and be diverted into sumps under the property and then pumped out, that will cost more. And obviously, off the top of my head, you know, an average of £30,000 for that system to be fully installed with the self-closing air bricks and the doors and the non-return valves and sump pumps, about that. But then we stop to think, we've already had the quote that one flood costs an average of £31,000. And trust me, the people I've talked to across the country will give me much bigger amounts, £48,000 upwards, I've been told. So after one flood, that money is paid back. And also, we mustn't forget the awful traumatic exposure that people go through of having to project manage a building site that's their home, live elsewhere and try to function normally while their home is repaired. All that can be factored in with pound signs. And one more thing while I'm still here is that while we've got Angela, you know, the media are incredibly powerful. And whenever they want to interview me outside, I have to stand, or they want me to stand next to a sandbag. So I've been saying to the Property Resilience Roundtable for a long time now that it's time to educate the media about PFR, and that is how we will mainstream it. Whenever I've seen articles written about PFR with a sandbag in the main picture. I mean, until we can get everybody singing from the same hymn sheet, we can't hope to influence those at the receiving end.
No, very, very good and very true. And I know I've heard your messages about sandbags many times, Mary, and I'm with you on that. So thank you for that. Listen, I'm afraid we have run out of time, sadly, but I just want to wrap up, if I can, by thanking a few people, and we will go through the questions, and any that we haven't answered, we will send a response out so that you've got that. And please do follow up with us at any point if you want any more information from any of our speakers that you've heard of today. So firstly, I'd like to thank Michelle for opening the conference today, and thank all of our speakers for their excellent presentations and insight. Just a few summary points to take away. That I think it's worth just re-emphasising before we leave is remember that the framework is available within Northern Ireland. Not sure, as Vicky said, what that will look like at the moment, but it is available. The code of practice, I would encourage you all, if you are doing schemes at all, to please take a look at that on the CERIA website, download it and have a look at it is a large document, but the guidance is fairly small. Flood Re's transition and Build Back Better is crucial. Their consultation results will be out sometime in the future, so please look out for those, and also for the DEFRA Call of Evidence, which will give a real good view, I think, over those two about how people are feeling about PFR. And standards and training absolutely is a crucial part of how this is going to get embedded in the future. And just forgive me for 1 second, because we've had some hot news off the press, which you may have heard about, which was worth mentioning, is that the Minister has announced in Northern Ireland that £3.45 million support scheme for Glenenny farmers. Now, I'm not going to go through all of that, but I'm sure you'll see that. So that's some good news. And finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors for the day, Watertight, Flood Re and CIWEM, and of course Stratagem for pulling the day together. I hope you've enjoyed it. Sorry, we had a couple of hiccups right at the beginning. So I didn't say at the beginning, but I've been Graham Brogden, and your host for today. And like I say, if you want any more information, please do get in touch. Thank you very much. Goodbye.